Reverend, jump in.
Yeah, I think you have to be careful, though, about just saying who can beat who. We don't know that yet. What I'm saying is it's not about who can beat who. It's not about an endorsement. You can't limit the black community to just criminal justice. You have to deal with that issue, and you can't just say we know what's in people's heart, because policy represents heart. That question has to be answered. But it must go deeper when you talk about African-American people. 26 million, 61% of African-Americans live in poverty and low wealth. Where do you stand there? Voter suppression. We have less voting rights today with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act than we had in 1965. Where would he as president stand on those things? And then with other minorities, where is he on the Native American indigenous community and the oppression still against them? All of these issues must be dealt with. Where is he on the war economy, since poor people and black people and minorities get hurt more when it comes to war and the money we spend on war that we don't put back in our communities? We need a deep dive on every one of these candidates.
Right.
And it can't just be an apology and a matter of the heart. We must look at the heart of policy.
So, Jeremy Peters, you're covering the campaign. What's it looking like on the ground?
Well, what was interesting last night, Mika, is at this initiative the Bloomberg campaign launched, Mike for Black America, which is intentional that it's Mike for Black America instead of Black America for Mike, because the campaign doesn't want to be sounding too presumptuous in a kind of I'm with her way. So what I heard last night from Mayor Bloomberg was the type of contrition that has often been lacking from some of his comments in the past. He has been reluctant to express, real regret for this when pressed about it. I mean, earlier this week, he gave kind of a ham-handed answer in explaining why he supported the stop-and-frisk policy. He, last night, in front of an audience of several hundred African Americans in Houston, really, I think, connected with the crowd in a way that I don't know that I really expected to see. I spent a lot of time talking to people before and after the event, and I've got to say that what I heard from them tracks with the Bloomberg campaign's internal polling, which has said that he's pulled about even with Joe Biden in terms of African American support. Not only that, Mika, but the reason that they're supporting him, or at least considering leaning toward voting for him, is they think that he can beat Trump. And that is such a paramount concern with the voters I have spoken with. They want to just make sure that there is not a second term for Donald Trump. And they look at Mike Bloomberg and they say, you know what, he can probably do this, but you know what? Joe Biden can't, not after the performance that we've seen from him the last few weeks, and their support for Biden has really, really faded.
Kathy.
By the way, that the memes seem to be having some impact on younger voters, because yesterday both my 25-year-old son and my 23-year-old daughter were sending me Bloomberg memes. So whether they think it's kind of cheesy or not, they're noticing. It's actually getting their attention.
Kathy, I want to jump in. Mika just asked, what is a meme?
Can you explain that to her?
So Mika, you and I will go offline afterwards and we'll have a little discussion about memes, okay? And we'll run through it. It'll all be good. One thing that I'm hearing, and I don't know, Jeremy, if you've been hearing this, there's some debate in the Bloomberg campaign. They're very conscious of the fact that he's a sort of boring speaker. He's not great on the stump. One advisor to Bloomberg yesterday was suggesting to me, you know what, maybe he just skips the debates altogether. Maybe not just the Democratic debates, but were he to become the nominee, why just say, I'm not going to debate Trump? I mean, why give Trump the free airtime, which Trump would love, right? He likes that format. And why put himself in the position of being up there when he's not very good at it? Just carry on with the shock and awe campaign of advertising and getting the narrative out as he wants to get it out.
Yeah, I do think that's right, that he is rusty at this. That's what they've spent the last few weeks, 6 weeks, doing, is trying to work out some of those kinks in his stump speech, in his interaction rapport with voters. He's getting better at it, but it's not all smooth sailing, I will say. But I would think that skipping the debates would be a real risk for him. He needs that exposure, and it would really undercut his case that he can beat Trump, because Trump would say, oh, he's afraid to stand next to me on the stage.
Michael Steele, he's a memer. Jump in.
A couple. I love the memes, but a couple of things. For heaven's sakes, the man ran for mayor 3 times. He knows how to do debates. He can do debates, and people kind of know what he's doing. I think he'll be fine on the front. I'm more interested in whether or not Donald Trump actually signs up to do debates as a presidential candidate this fall. So that's the one I'm watching. But I think I want to go back to Reverend Barber's point, which I think is an essentially important one, but it's juxtaposed against what Donnie said. And that reflects the pragmatism of the black vote that Jeremy just expressed, that while there is this real concern about where these individuals in the Democratic Party are standing on some very important issues for African Americans, particularly as it has been raised by black women over the last year, there's also this pragmatic aspect is, can we just get him out? And then we'll double back on these issues. But there is this strain of wanting to hold these individuals. At least, can you give me some indication of where you're going to be on these critical issues? And Reverend, I think that's really the rub here for a lot of African Americans as they move off of Biden right on to Bloomberg. They're not looking at these other candidates who've been in this fight for over a year. They've moved from one person who's trusted and been a part of the family, if you will, to someone that they've had some suspicions about. And how do you assess that sort of rub within the community itself right now?
Well, I think a number of things. First of all, we have to remember 100 million people didn't vote in the last election, and particularly in the South where we need some major transformation. Millions and millions of African Americans did not vote. Many of them are poor and low wealth because they never hear their name or their condition. I also think black Americans have always had to make very pragmatic decisions. That's not what I'm saying. Certainly people want Trump out, and that's a decision, but you have to have a vigorous debate to make sure that you don't get tripped up later on. And one of the things that we say about Bloomberg is with slavery, with any policy that was bad, civil rights or segregation, what do you do with the thousands of people that were impacted by this bad policy? You can't just say, I apologize. What is the plan? How do you have restoration for the thousands of people? And then how do you go deeper? We cannot limit the African-American understanding of politics and how we address politicians in just one area. And so what we're arguing is you have to deal with all of the issues. Black people are looking at all of them. And poverty and low wealth is critical. 61% of African Americans live in poverty and low wealth, many women, many children. How is he or any candidate speaking to that issue that can not only bring blacks out that came out last time, but expand the electorate, the electorate. And we have to have that conversation. You can't leave it off the table. And I still think it's too early. I think people are still moving back and forth, but I'm hearing a lot of people saying they want to hear, I'm crisscrossing this country, those issues dealt with, the economic issues, the criminal justice issues, the healthcare issues, the voting right issues. Let's hear on all of the issues that impact black people, poor white people, and minorities. So let's have a full thoroughgoing of his positions. And we can't merely say, I'm sorry for a past policy that hurt thousands of people, and not talk about how do I restore those people who were hurt.
Totally agree. And as we close, go back to the social media angle. Mike Bloomberg, Taylor, does he have a Snapchat filter?
No, and he doesn't.
Okay, does he use emojis?
No.
Does he have his own emoji?
Not as far as I know.
What? A talking one? He doesn't have one?
No.
Okay. How about GIFs? Does he use GIFs?
I believe he does use GIFs.
He uses GIFs. Does he have a GIF of him shaking the dog's head?
Who's giving you all these terms? Because I know you don't know.
I know what a GIF is.
Oh, you do?
I do.
Okay.
It's like over and over again. But you know what? So you said there are memers?
Yes. Yeah. There are people that run these highly influential meme accounts with millions and tens of millions of followers.
They get paid to do this?
They get paid, millions of dollars to do that. And by the way, if for Bernie Sanders, they're the memers that are speaking out, just organically. They're not asking for money. So Bloomberg has to pay these influencers. An
organic memer, that's what you're going for. Is there an app that gets young people to vote? I'm looking for that one.
It's called Instagram.
Okay, Walter Isaacson, Taylor Lorenz, Jeremy Peters. Thank you all. Reverend Barber, thank you so much as well.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.